Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. This week, we are back with Vikram and Betal. We'll see why, when you're the king, you should be careful who you delegate a task to. They might do exactly the opposite of what you intend. The character this week has a lasso, just like Wonder Woman's. But this one is made of snakes. And his ride is a crocodile-fish. The association with aquatic creatures makes complete sense, since he is, after all, the god of the sea. If you haven't heard the previous Vikram and Betal episodes, that's still okay, because all of the stories are standalone. I do recommend checking out episode 5, Kingly Duties, though, because there's some useful background information on why Vic and the vampire were on their rinse and repeat cycle. Here's a quick summary. There was once a wise king called Vikramaditya. We're just going to call him Vic. Once, a rishi gave him a gift every day, a precious gem disguised as fruit. To repay the gifts, the king agreed to fulfill the rishi's very simple wish of fetching him a betal from the crematorium. A betal, in case you don't know, is a reanimated corpse, though in some translations it has been approximated to a vampire. The betal mostly loved hanging around in a tree by hanging down from it, like a bat. He did not want to be captured. The only way he could escape was if the king said something. So the betal told stories to the king, and those stories were all lateral thinking puzzles. They tricked the king into speaking somehow. The king was smart enough to know the answer, but not smart enough to hold his tongue. There are 25 such stories, because though Vic was wise, he didn't learn from previous iterations. The betal did make it easy for Vic by always flying back to the very same branch on the very same tree. So Vic was able to easily capture him again. This week's story begins right after the last one. The betal was back in his tree again. Vic climbed the tree again, captured him again, and was carrying him to the rishi across the crematorium again. The betal started with the same premise as on previous occasions. Hey Vic, it's a long walk across the crematorium. It was obviously not a long walk, but Vic didn't reply, because if he did, the betal could escape back to his tree. The betal continued, "Let me tell you a story to pass the time." "This story is about a king," said the betal. The king, let's call him Kumar, was a good administrator, but a little bit distracted at times. he had recently succeeded to the throne. And so far, things were going well. Except he didn't have a queen. And he needed one. You know, for all the social events and the alliance building and trading with other nations and stuff. These were ancient times that we are talking about. So a potential candidate for queen would be judged mostly by her looks and her pedigree. The king had his people prepare a list. All the noble bachelorettes in his kingdom were on it. The next thing he wanted was to filter these down to the best. The king saw this part as a bit of a formality, really. In his mind, he already knew who would emerge as the best in the list. There was a lady who was well known for her beauty. Let's call her Surup. The king hadn't actually seen Surup, but that didn't matter. He knew many artists and poets had based their greatest works on Surup, and that had to mean something. Nevertheless, the kingdom's protocol had to be followed, and he had to give everyone else on the list a fighting chance. So he handed the list over to his palace maid and asked her to go on a scouting trip. Satya, the palace maid, had earned King Kumar's trust by being honest and smart as well. She interviewed every single lady on the list, and that too in stealth mode. So the ladies never realized they were being interviewed for the full-time position of Queen of the land. That basically meant Satya couldn't ask to see their resume. And she skipped the typical strengths and weaknesses questions as well. After Satya met every one of the ladies, there was no doubt in her mind that Surup was way more beautiful than everyone else. Surup was in a class of her own. But the maid didn't rush back to the king and congratulate him on his choice. She was deep in thought. Finally, she came to a painful realization. There was no doubt that the king would be completely captivated by Surup's beauty. He would neglect to rule his kingdom and spend entire days and nights together only with Surup. Normally, a little bit of delegating would have been good for everyone. But with Surup as queen, the king would completely ignore everything else. There would be anarchy if the king neglected his duties. She decided she must make the decision that was right for the kingdom, even if it was the wrong decision for the king personally. She decided on another lady on the list, who was more or less 50th percentile. Let's call her Rani. The maid reported back to King Kumar that Rani was definitely the right choice for the position of queen. "What about Surup?" asked the king, surprised. The maid paused and then said, "Oh, I'm sure she's all beautiful on the inside," and then lapsed back into silence. King Kumar sighed. Between dozens of courtiers who attested to Surup's beauty and Satya's testimony, whom was he going to trust? Of course, he would trust Satya, just as Satya knew he would. "All right, Kumar was ready to marry Rani instead. The wedding was announced and invites were sent out. Rani, who had readily agreed to the wedding, busied herself picking the decor of her future palace rooms. Surup's parents had secretly been hoping that she would marry the king. But now that was not to be. So they lost no time in arranging her marriage to the next most eligible bachelor. Surup's fiancé was a general in King Kumar's army. Let's call him Mahan, which literally means noble. Being a general in the army was a pretty solid position to be in. I don't just mean having a taxpayer-funded villa with a 3-chariot garage for all the siren-equipped horse-drawn chariots. One of the perks was that as the general's significant other, you got to go to royal parties. That's where Surup went. Over the chips and dip, she ran into the king. The king, who was seeing her for the very first time, was astounded by her beauty. And that was how the whole can of worms was opened up. King Kumar wanted to know who she was, and was immediately told that that was Surup, General Mahan's fiancé. Kumar did what leaders do when confronted by such a situation. He gathered Satya, Surup, and Mahan into a conference room to talk about their awkward situation. Satya blurted out the truth, including her motive for hiding the truth about Surup's beauty. As soon as Mahan realized where this was going, he quickly volunteered to break off the engagement so that Kumar and Surup could marry. Kumar wouldn't hear any of it. He ordered Surup and Mahan to continue with their wedding plans. As for Satya, he was going to punish her. That's where I'll end my story, said the Betal. Answer 2 questions for me, Vicky, old boy. What should Satya's punishment be? And whose sacrifice was nobler, Mahan's or King Kumar's? Vic had the answer ready, of course. Satya should not be punished at all. She acted with the best of intentions. Her loyalty was to the kingdom, not to the king. And don't let any leader of any nation convince you otherwise. As for what you called sacrifice, I refuse to recognize it as such. Was it right for Kumar to decide on a queen on looks alone? Was it right for Mahan and Kumar to sit in a room and decide Surup's life for her? Why doesn't she have a voice in her own future? The Betal replied, Why, your answers are even better than what I had in mind. The times are changing indeed. An ancient me would have accepted a completely misogynistic answer. But that's all beside the point. What matters now is that you spoke, so I'm free. The Betal flew back to his hangout in the tree. Vic will go back and get him, of course. But that's for a later episode. Some notes on the show. The names of the characters in the Betal's story are Hindi words. Kumar means boy or young man, but it is also sometimes used to mean bachelor. Surup means beautiful, and Mahan means noble, because he was portrayed as noble in the original story, though his last action is not exactly noble. Finally, Satya, the untruthful maid. Satya means the truth. I picked that just for a bit of contrast. But another way of explaining that is that she is truthful in the end, and her lie is motivated by a higher purpose. The original story had Vic declare Mahan to be the nobler, given that he was sacrificing his life and the life of his fiancée for the king's sake. But it is not noble to make Surup's life choices for her. It's also not noble for the king to order two people to be married. For all he knew, Surup had probably changed her mind about marrying somebody who was ready to call off their engagement just because the king took a fancy to her. The character this week has a lasso, just like Wonder Woman's. But this one is made of snakes, and his ride is a crocodile-fish. Varun is the god of the sea. His crocodile-fish joins the list of unusual fish species we've encountered on this podcast, including the unicorn fish, the rainbow fish, and the laughing fish. We'll talk about the crocodile-fish another time though. Let's talk about Varun. Varun is one of the oldest gods in Indian mythology. He's the god not just of the sea, but also the sky, clouds, and rain. In fact, he's responsible for the water cycle on Earth. In some variations of the tales, Varun was an Asur who became a Dev. You can learn more about the rivalry between the Asurs and the Devs in episode 27, The Rise of Shukra. Strangely similar to the Greek god Poseidon, Varun also was sometimes associated with horses. And not just sea horses, I mean land horses. Varun has 1,000 eyes, so he can see everywhere. His noose is made of snakes. Once it binds someone, it's quite unbreakable, just like Wonder Woman's lasso. We've briefly encountered Varun before as one of the gods that gifted Hanuman in episode 25. Varun makes an appearance in the Ramayana, but we'll cover that in a future Ramayana episode. If you're wondering how the state of Kerala was created, it was Varun, at the request of Parshuram, an avatar of Vishnu we've met before. Check out some of the pictures I've linked on the site, sfipodcast.com, including a shrine in Japan dedicated to Varun. That's all for this week. If you have comments or suggestions, please leave a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all you listeners for your continued support. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. Next week, we'll see how I, personally, was involved in the Indian mythology version of Sleeping Beauty. There's no princess in this one. Instead, there are a couple of brothers. And spoiler alert, there's no evil fire-breathing dragon either. The character next week is not one single person. Instead, it's a role. There are 7 people who have occupied this role so far, one of whom we encountered in our very first episode, Unicorn Fish. I'll see you next week.